Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks.
Hey potty people, Robin here. Alicia and I are coming up on our 3-year anniversary of our first published episode. I can't believe it. And we have published over 100 episodes, like 16 or 17,000 downloads. It's so surprising, and we're so grateful every single day that we get to do this for fun on the side. But we need you. Do you have a story to share? Do you want to share your story? We want to hear from you. If you're interested in being a guest on our show, DM me on Instagram at Bowel Moments Pod. I'm the one who handles all of our social media, so you will be talking to me. Do you know somebody with an incredible story, or somebody that you follow on social media that you want to know more about their story? Tell us about them. Even better, make an IG introduction for me. We're on the lookout for topics for the show. What do you want to know more about? What research topics are you curious about? Please let me know. Your input makes our podcast better. Thank you so much for listening. And I can't wait to hear from you. Cheers.
This week, we talked to Dr. Alan Moss. Dr. Moss is the Chief Scientific Officer at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation in the United States. Previous to that, he was the director of the Crohn's and Colitis program at Boston Medical Center and professor of medicine at Boston University. We talked to him about why he switched from patient care to this new role. We talked to him about what his plans are for the future of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's research program. We talked to him about AI and its implications in patient care and research. We talked to him about their research protocol from prevention to remission to healing damage. And we talked to him about the new 5-year strategic plan that he has for research goals for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Cheers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia, and we are really excited to be joined by Dr. Alan Moss. Dr. Moss, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
May I call you Alan from now on?
Yes, please do.
Great. Thank you. I always like to ask, you worked hard for that degree. I'm excited to let everybody know your story and to have you tell us all about your previous work and now your current work. But my very first unprofessional question for you is, what are you drinking?
So I'm in Manhattan right now. It's summer. And so I have a milkshake from a famous Manhattan milkshake and burger place.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
Are the first person I think that's drank a milkshake on the show, and I am here for it. That sounds so good now. Oh, I love it.
I know. I'm like, dang, I want a milkshake.
I know. What flavor is it?
Vanilla.
Classic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Robin, what about you?
I got fancy with my mocktail. I muddled some blueberries, and I have a lime and mint Topo Chico.
That sounds lovely.
Yes. Of course, I also have the flat water next to me, multiple beverages at all times.
I'm surprised there's a lot of coffee in there as well, just for good measure.
No, not today. How about you, Alicia?
Well, I have to go get myself on a plane here as soon as we're done talking. And so I decided not to have a cocktail. Also, I was running out of time. So I am drinking a Spindrift unsweetened lemonade. Not sponsored by, but we'll take you, Spindrift.
Yes. Topo Chico too.
But this is not about what we're drinking. This is about you. So Alan, tell us your IBD story. What made you decide to become a doctor that specializes in inflammatory bowel disease?
So good question. I was thinking about this, and I think 2 things happened during my training that probably put me down this path. One is patient focus, and the other is, about opportunities that come up in your career. So the patient focus thing that got me into IBD was when I was a resident in Dublin. I trained in Ireland. We had referred a young lady who had really bad Crohn's disease, and my colleagues weren't sure what to do and said to me, look, when you go up, see what the latest research is and figure out, can we come up with a plan for this woman who was just recently married and had pretty bad active Crohn's disease. And at the time, it was around the time the first big US study came out on methotrexate, the National Crohn's Cooperative Study, which was a big deal at the time because it was unusual for lots of centers to get together and pool their ideas through research. So I read that study, brought it back, and, we decided that we would treat this woman with methotrexate at the time, which was a big deal. And just that whole experience of seeing her journey, seeing how tough it was for her, but also seeing that there was, big research happening that could help her, I thought, wow, this is an interesting part of medicine. The second thing that got me into the IBD space was when I was training at the time, ECHO, which is the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization, had this program where they would take 2 trainees from every country in Europe and bring them to one location and have them meet all the big IBD experts at the time and go through basically a weekend of everything you need to do at IBD, like IBD 101. And that, just for me as a junior trainee to sit in the room with all these famous people, Simon Travis, Severine Vermeer, lots of famous people, was like A, really encouraging and motivating, and B, hugely informative to see how much was happening. That would have been probably, early 2000s in the IBD space. So they were the 2 things that got me. And, one was obviously learning the patient journey. And the second one was having an opportunity that, not many people could get at the time.
That sounds super interesting. And yeah, what a life-changing experience for a young trainee. I'm curious how you got from Ireland to the United States, though.
Good question. So at the time, Ireland is a kind of a unique system in that there are lots of trainees with very few attending positions. So if you want to kind of become an attending, you have to, at the time, and not really so much now, had to go abroad to either the UK or the US and get some specialization. And so at the time, there was an AGA international fellowship to come to the US, do some research for a year, and then go back to where you came from. That clearly didn't work out because I came for a year and I'm here 15 years later. But that was also a great opportunity sponsored by the AGN at the time. That was Centocor. It was around the time Remicade came around. I'm okay to mention the name because, credit where credit's due. They funded this for people to do some research. I did research at Beth Israel in the lab, really enjoyed it. Also did some clinical research and then decided, wow, this is great. This is very exciting. And then was fortunate enough to be invited to stay on at Beth Israel in Boston. And that's kind of how I got on this path.
Fantastic. And so then how long did you practice at Beth Israel?
Oh, I was there for 15 years at Beth Israel and then for 3 years at Boston Medical Center.
And now you have transitioned. So you used to do direct patient care, but just not long ago, you were named the Chief Scientific Officer of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation here in the United States. So talk to us about what was the impetus for even applying for that job and wanting to move away from patient care and into the sort of nonprofit space?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A lot of people have asked me that. Like, why would someone who's been like in clinic, in research for many, many years do this? The main factor for me was thinking about impact. You can have a certain amount of impact with an individual patient on a one-on-one over many, many years, which I've had for many, many years. But then you can have a whole different impact at a regional or national level with something like what the foundation does. And so having been in practice and in research for 15 plus years, I decided, I need to think about doing something different. And I need to think about what could I take all my experience and, knowledge that would be impactful beyond just the one-on-one patient interactions. And as we all know, the foundation is one of the kind of biggest foundations out there that does lots of research, takes funding from various sources and donors and families, and tries to make the best use of it. And so for me, that was a really unique opportunity that was very hard to pass when it came up. And probably there are very few like it in certainly in the IBD community. And it was definitely a transition, going from a hospital where you're kind of, for the most part, and as a physician in a hospital system, you're relatively independent to do your own thing. You see your patients, to being in a foundation that has a corporate structure and an organizational structure that obviously takes some adaptation, but definitely the benefits of that, or the potential benefits for me were hugely encouraging and definitely exciting.
What was the hardest part about leaving practice? And then also, what was the most exciting thing? Like, what was the one thing that when you looked at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation and you looked at this job, you were like, I like that. Let's start with the patients because they're the most important.
Yes, it was very hard. Some of the patients, as I got close to finishing, I've been patients who I've been their physician since they were in high school and then college and then getting married and having kids. And I was like, wow, we've been together for 10, 15 years. There's not many specialties, I think, where you build that bond over right through high school, right the way through. And, you see patients you know really well come back and they've had their first kid. And you come back, they've had their second kid and you go, oh my God. Then you feel old, right? Because people are going through all the life changes right in front of you. But then to suddenly break that, and it was like a long-term relationship. Like, it's not you, it's me. I'm just deciding to change my career. It's very very hard to make that decision. But I think, thankfully, all my patients who I'd had for many, many years saw how important the opportunity would be. We're grateful that we'd worked together for many years, but also wish me the best of luck. And that's probably as much as I could ask for. The second part of the question is, what was the one thing where I said, okay, this is worth the jump? Because it was a bit of a leap to move, from practice to, I think seeing last year, I went to the foundation for some other activity before this role came up, and I met the research team, and I was so impressed by the depth of knowledge, how, smart the team were, what they were doing with what they had resource-wise. And I said, wow, if I have an opportunity to help this and really help, move it along, I'd be crazy not to take it and bring what I have to the table.
I love that. That's so fantastic. And I think, it must be so incredibly rewarding to be a direct practitioner where you do get that personal relationship with a patient, and then you do get to see them go through all these amazing life transitions, including having kids and maybe doing some things that they really had a hard time envisioning or maybe struggled with along the way. That gives me chills. That's great.
And also, even in that time, I've seen all the new treatments come along and seen a lot of patients do far better than they did when I was a junior trainee, right? You see people now in long-term remission for 5-10 years, which would have been unheard of 15 years ago. So to watch that arc of, now, obviously it's not perfect, but to see that arc of improvement and see people, go to college, move on with their lives, put the Crohn's or the colitis in the back seat is really, really encouraging.
So now that you've been there for a few months, what are you most excited about on the horizon?
Yeah, so I've had a good chance to, if you like, look under the hood of the foundation and see everything that's happening. And I didn't realize how much was going on. Even now, I'm learning about, what's happening. I think most people think of the foundation in, advocacy, giving out awards, research awards, and then all the public service stuff they do. But there's other parts that actually are really interesting that not many nonprofits do. For example, the foundation has a ventures arm that invests in small companies. They've invested in about 26 companies to date to bring companies into the space who otherwise might not be interested in IBD. And there's patient registries that the foundation has established. They all fall into this large repository called Plexus that analyzes the data and works with academia and industry to try and answer questions that no one else can answer. Those two pieces are probably two pieces where you see, wow, they're not very well known, but the potential impact is huge. And, because big data now is a huge resource. You can answer questions of big data that either no investigator can do by themselves and no pharma company can do by themselves. And I think that's what's going to drive some of the innovations, is having lots of data. And importantly to recognize, it's all data where patients have said, yeah, we want to give you our information. We see the value of, contributing it, and we'd rather give it to you, to the foundation, than give it to someone else.
Yeah, the Plexus program has been really fascinating because it is, like you said, people are opting in and providing information, and it's anonymized to be able to allow for people to pull that data, to be able to find, like you said, information about a whole subset of people that maybe, you want to know about middle-aged women with ulcerative colitis who've only ever taken mesalamine, something like that. It can be very granular. But I am curious, in light of some of the more recent data breaches that have been happening, how are you reassuring patients that this data is protected? And also, I'm curious if you saw a downturn in the number of people participating.
Yeah, I mean, I can at a high level tell you that, at entry, the data gets anonymized. So once it goes in, it's anonymized. It would be very hard to backtrack and figure out who is where. And they're coming from 100 different sites, and they all then go into this anonymized collection. So, the security levels in terms of data protection are kind of industry standards. But we all realize, I've seen it happen, right? You get a letter in the mail, sorry, someone got into your data and so forth. Thankfully for that, most of it's so anonymized and in such a pool of over 10,000 patients, it will be very hard for you to figure out who anyone individually is. But when patients sign up, to be fair, they do realize that, there's pros and cons, and the benefits are advancing research. There's always a small risk of loss of confidentiality, like there is with anything. One of the things we're seeing advance with the opportunities is to say, okay, rather than having to manually enter everyone's data or ask patient-specific questions, is can you just scrape the medical record and pull in all the information with the patient's consent, and then use some of the AI tools like large language models to maybe recognize patterns that right? A good example there is we say, well, what's your risk of developing advanced Crohn's disease? There's a model based on what experts think, but what if there's a different model just based on AI that we've never recognized before, but it's actually a better model than a bunch of experts sitting in a room think? So those kind of possibilities, I think, really open up potential innovations that we couldn't do with just sitting through a database looking for patterns at the human level. So again, lots of benefits, but all these things have all some, low-level potential risks.
Yes, I know there's probably enough pieces in there that talk about how, yes, you're providing this willingly and stuff like that. And you're right. I mean, the data does get anonymized right from the beginning so that there is the protection so that you're not able to be recognized. I'm super curious about the AI aspect of thing and sort of your thoughts on this, because one of the criticisms of AI is that because AI is fueled by people having to sort of provide information in about what to look for, that there are some concerns about diversity, equity, and inclusion in sort of the outcomes of this too. How are you guys combating that if you're looking at this as a potential way of kind of finding patterns? Is there something you're doing to ensure that it's not perpetuating negative patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I'm conscious that, a lot of the sites we use are big academic sites, right? The famous IBD centers. And if you look at their populations, they're not diverse, right? One of the things we've focused with both, let's say, Spark, which is the adult cohort, and Chorus, which is the quality of care initiative, is to really diversify sites. And we've added a bunch more sites that do have more diverse populations, because we don't want a cohort that's just full of, middle-aged men or middle-aged white women, right? Because that's not representative. So I think the key for those endeavors is, firstly, diversify the sites you use, diversify the researchers who are signing on from more opportunities from different centers. And one example is we got a grant from the CDC last year to specifically work with the University of Alabama on trying to diversify patients who enroll in clinical trials, right? Big barriers there. People often never even get asked to be in a clinical trial because there's some assumptions made, and trying to see how can we overcome those barriers so you do offer trials to everyone who might be eligible, not just the people in the big centers. I think that's one step towards helping diversify both access to trials and also access to any kind of research in IBD. Well, actually, on the AI thing, I will add that, once a lot of people have reached out to us, said, hey, can we use AI on your data, right? Because that's it. All the tools need data to feed them. And we've had to be very conscious about, who would we collaborate with the data and AI? Because one of the things with AI is, and one of the potentials is, that people can create synthetic data from real data. So use an algorithm to take, data on 100 patients and create data on a brand new 100 hypothetical patients, right?
Whoa.
And so we've got to be very cautious about who we collaborate with to make sure that we secure the data and that no one's just taking the data for those purposes. They're using it within a contained manner purely for the agreed purpose. And there's a lot of kind of knowns and unknowns right now at AI, but we're trying to make sure that we're as careful as we can to make the most of the opportunity, but obviously not take any risks that AI may, pose in the future.
Wow. This is me being old, basically. But, there is an aspect of this that just is like, how the hell do you keep up? How do you know what you don't know? Like, how do you try to find the right person to work with to be able to use this data when you don't really know what you don't know and you don't know how to ask these questions? I feel very stupid, to be honest, because I just don't even know what I don't know.
Right.
Well, yeah, you're right, because no one knows. And we have, as you can imagine, everyone's promising the Earth, Moon, and stars right now with AI. Much of it will never pan out. And so I think our IT team have been very rigorous about saying, here's the checklist. We need to go through all these things with any potential partners, and B, to try and future-proof, basically, future partnerships as much as we can know right now and how we might predict things may go. And again, there could be amazing innovations and patterns and novel innovations and learnings about IBD we just couldn't make with human knowledge, but we got to do it with those guardrails to make sure no one takes advantage of it.
I'm so glad we went down this road, because I was going to ask about AI, and I'm sitting over here using AI to write emails, and you're using AI to compile data surf, scrape the data. It's amazing. With all of that being said, then what do you see as being next in that step? I feel like we've talked about what's happening right now, but what do you feel like is going to be next with that?
Well, one of the limitations of, for example, the cohorts work we do where we have patients sign up and enroll and submit their data is that it's very limited to having sites willing to do it, right? And they're usually the big sites, and most places haven't got the time and effort. We have been looking at the best way to do what's called direct-to-patient registries, where if you go online, you might find through a search engine this opportunity, you sign up, and then you would directly agree to submit your own information, either actively or passively, to someone like the foundation, or your medical records passively to the foundation. And the foundation then would, clean it all up, compile it in a way that's really useful. And there may be things here that we learn directly from patients who are in the community, and to the earlier point, more diverse than we might learn from just having the small subset who get to go to big university IBD centers. And maybe there's things there we're missing about the IBD journey that are in that information. So direct to patient is one thing we're very interested in, to really get more information and a more holistic view of the patient journey and experience. Because we know many people, the first opportunity to learn about IBD could be through a surgeon or a community GI who don't really have a particular interest in IBD. And, that can be good, but can also delay getting the right place at the right time. So direct to patient is one thing. I think that's exciting as a way of just learning more. But there will also be great potential for AI to look for maybe novel pathways, novel molecules that we're not currently finding with current knowledge, and give us novel drug targets. Because we all know we have some great drugs, but none of them are cures, and none of them are giving us 80% remission rates. And so if AI could crack that, it would be definitely worth it. Putting the information in to come to a target that had an 80% remission rate. I think most patients would say, yeah, we're willing to do that. We'd like to take that risk with the data piece to get the information about drugs and drug pathways.
That's exciting. The direct to patient thing, that is going to be key, because I saw a community GI for years and years and years before I went to an institution that is now a core site. But before that, it was just community GI, and I would have gladly contributed, my medical record to that. And I know tons of people would, but they're just in rural places. They see their regular community GI.
There's no opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I'm quite excited about, which is totally different, but hopefully of interest to your listeners, is how could we prevent IBD in the first place, right? If you look at China, Russia, Brazil, there's a huge rise in IBD there. Never seen Crohn's colitis before. There aren't enough GIs and colonoscopies in the world to diagnose all those potential patients. But if we could prevent it before it develops, that would be a game changer.
Absolutely. And that actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because my next question to you is going to be having that connection back to ECHO, that is whether Plexus is replicated in other places and whether that data is being combined to see those patterns in other countries.
So as you can imagine, most big countries have their own registries. There's a big Spanish registry. There's a great one that comes right from birth in Denmark. I was at ECHO in February, and I started to meet the people who look after those to see, is there a way that we could maybe not pool all the data, but for a specific question, extract data from, let's say, 4 or 5 different registries and pool it just for one question, which is called data federation. And that might answer big questions that no one else can answer by themselves. So I think that kind of global consensus or global working together, there's a lot of interest in. We just got to find out the right mechanism, because Europe has very strict data rules, more strict than the US, ways that it makes it work within multiple different jurisdictions.
That's cool. I like that prospect of sharing data across countries.
Most countries are reluctant to share all their data, and there's a European effort to share all the data across multiple European countries, but they've actually had challenges in getting agreement. But one solution to that is this data federation idea, where you just say, look, we just want data on this specific question. We pool it. We have scale to answer big questions no one else can ask, but the data stays within their own registries, so it's secure from that perspective. That would probably help. For example, right, they're seeing an increase in IBD cases in Africa, right? How does it look in Africa compared to how it looks in New York or London? There's probably very important lessons there as the developing world sees more and more cases of Crohn's and colitis.
I'm curious if there's also ways to be able to look at healthcare access within that, because for instance, you come from Ireland. Ireland has a socialized medicine system. I'm curious if there's ways to track disease progression, disease treatment, differences in disease treatment in countries that have that socialized medicine system and the United States. Because we do hear that perhaps someplace like the UK leans more into using some of the older medications like the mesalamines because of the sort of cost savings.
Yeah, the question you're getting, I think you can answer multiple ways. Even within the US, you can compare, and people have compared by state, right? Massachusetts has a universal healthcare across the state. Other states don't. If you compare states that do and don't, you will see that there's difference in terms of access, in terms of treatment exposure, time to diagnosis. And so I think it's not by country, but it's basically where you have access to the screening test. Now, you might argue, and in some countries, doing a colonoscopy is just not feasible. There's not enough people around to do them. But if you could do fecal calprotectin as a screening tool for everyone with diarrhea, my guess is you would pick up far more earlier IBD cases than waiting for everyone to have a colonoscopy. So we could be thinking about this not as much as, how to get better access, but how are we smarter about screening people with symptoms for Crohn's or colitis? And then once they get diagnosed, then fast tracking them into, the right centers. But I do agree, you do need a certain minimal level of ability to do screening tests, which is not universal. And then once you have the screening test complete, get into a specialist center. And we do know that specialized IBD centers generally have better outcomes than if you're going to community centers. Not through fault of anyone, just that the structures are not there and the systems are not there. If you have Crohn's, you want to be where someone that's a psychologist, nutritionist, a pharmacologist, all those things. That kind of team behind you is really key versus your community GI struggling to do that and do the colonoscopies and manage the liver patients and everything else. So those kind of efforts could be really meaningful at a regional level, even never mind a national level.
Yeah, we say that on a very regular basis that, the getting to a specialized physician but especially a specialized center that has all of those wraparound sort of services is going to give you a really different experience.
I think one of the things the foundation education team has focused on the last 2 years has been providing virtual training for PAs, virtual training for nutritionists or dietitians and pharmacists to really help bring them up to speed. So even if you haven't got them in your team, your local pharmacist is comfortable with IBD drugs, that they're helping you or helping the physicians and then the APPs rather than just waiting to go to a specialist center.
And I mean, let's be honest, if you're a community GI and only 5% of your practice is IBD, it's really not financially feasible. It doesn't make sense for you to get specialized training in IBD when most of your practice is liver or something else. So we always tell people to, even if you just go for like a second opinion or maybe like collaborative care with your community GI in that center, having somebody that specializes in IBD will help your outcomes. But like I said, it just doesn't make sense for that community GI, which has such a small percentage of its practice as IBD, to seek that outside education.
And I think it's important for patients to not to be afraid to say to their physician, look, I need to get a second opinion here. And most reasonable physicians will say, I agree with you, right? It's time to move on. This is not a straightforward case. Certainly don't be shy about asking for that opinion. I know people are often afraid to do it, that they might offend somebody, but actually you're far better off in the long term making that. Even raising the question can get the cogs turning and, help you get to wherever has the specialist care you need.
Yeah, we have said that before that, and you as a physician, I hope will agree with us that any doctor worth their salt will be comfortable with you getting a second opinion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was in Boston for many years where there's an IBD center on every corner. And I'd often ask people, I'd see people who have seen 4 different experts in Boston. And I'd say, that's fine. I'll give you my opinion and I'm happy for you to go and get someone else's. That's just, it's part of the course. You want people to find the right fit. And sometimes just physicians and patients connect and sometimes they just don't.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, like you said, you're with your patients for 10, 15, even longer. This is a long-term relationship that we're in. So you need to find somebody that you can maintain that relationship with. I mean, even I've said on the show, I asked my GI, I said, I want a surgical consult after what happened with me surgically. And so like, even just that kind of thing, advocating for yourself and asking your doctor for what you need is important.
And there's lots of gray areas in IBD that there's no right or wrong answer, right? There's just middle ground. And, I think it's important to ask the questions. And the great question I often find from patients that say to you is, what would you do? Which is a great leveler, right? If that was you, what would you do? Or if it was your sister or mom, brother, what would you do? And I think that allows you to just get their perspective on, okay, all things considered, this is what I would do. And there's an element of trust there, right? You just got to take that leap, that trust them that they have your best interests at heart and realize that some of the areas are not entirely precise, but they just are making the best decision that fits with your needs. Because some patients are very risk averse and some patients are not at all and want just to get the most effective treatment regardless. And you got to find the right fit and meet the patient in the middle, so to speak.
Yeah. And one of the things that I know has been interesting is when, some of the potential side effects of the medications, like, there's an increased risk of cancer kind of thing. Some people that just like those risk averse people you're talking about, that just throws them for a loop. And they're like, absolutely not. Why would I ever do this? Even though when you start to actually like show what that looks like on a chart of like, this is your risk versus what you thought your risk was, there's like some better understanding. But people like me are not great at math. So,
but actually, it's remarkable how far we've come. When you think of it, when Remicade came along, and it's okay if I name drop because it was the first one, but when Remicade came along, we were giving it to patients on the way to the operating room, right? Because it was like a Hail Mary pass. Now we're so comfortable with what the risk profile looks like for all these drugs that we're giving it sometimes to people as the first treatment they ever get exposed to, because we know probably your best shot was at your first drug, regardless of what that is. And the safety that we were worried about early on has, thankfully, we've mitigated it by, screening for TB and doing all these other things. And we're much more comfortable. And thankfully, patients are much more comfortable with, basically what's my next biologic doc, right? What's it going to be? As opposed to before, we were all worried about different tumors and cancers. And thankfully, they're so rare, it's not putting people off getting the right treatment anymore.
Taking us in a slightly different direction, because you queued this up very nicely. You mentioned screening tests, and we just recently had Dr. Erica Barnell on the show with Genoscopy, and she was one of the folks that did actually get involved in and I believe benefit from the Ventures program. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about IBD Ventures. What is that, and how do the recipients get chosen?
So it's like any process, typically there's 1 or 2 cycles every year and various companies apply for funding. The foundation has a review panel made up of, finance people, scientists, technology engineers that reviews all of them. They get scored, and then basically every year, usually a handful are picked for final round, and then 1 or 2 are picked to get funded. And the funding is, often like $200,000, right? To kind of seed money, get people off the ground. If you look at the 26 companies that have been funded to date, they have gone on to generate several hundred million of their own funding subsequently. And so I think that what tells you is the interest is there to make these companies succeed from the finance world because they see potential, and they've been able to launch and go into the next round of funding beyond what someone like the foundation could do for them. I think it's important that there's lots of technologies out there and therapies that may not come into the space unless there was someone to provide them seed funding, because it's too risky. They're not sure of the support. And I think having the support of something like the foundation helps get them there, because maybe the next drug for IBD comes from a totally different field that we didn't expect.
Is there a process by which you decide who gets funded? That's like, is it like we'll do 2 tests this year and 2 wearable devices? Or is there sort of a prescriptive sort of idea of who you want to fund or what types of projects you're wanting to fund? Or is it literally just these are 20 things and those things seem the most viable or interesting?
Yeah, it's an open process because every year it's different, right? We get a different mix of companies apply. And so some years it's all devices, other years it's all drugs, other years it's a mix of both. The main criteria that the fund that the team looks for are, viability, feasibility. Does the science make sense? And that's really what then says, okay, if this looks viable, the science makes sense, it's feasible in terms of this company structure, then we invest in them. And we hope them to succeed. We can often will try and help them on the way, like give them advice on trials or give them access to data. Our Plexus data become like small members of Plexus, and they can access the data. Because if you're a small company, that kind of information is invaluable to get you launched, right? To help you make a case for, okay, this is the patient population we're going to aim for, and this is the unmet need. And it's very hard to understand that need unless you've got someone to help show you in the direction of where the need is in IBD. A good example is, we've seen a lot more devices now, both wearables, measuring inflammatory levels, and also devices focused on treating some of the symptoms of IBD that were never in our space before, but there's a gap for them. And we want to encourage them to be there and to give patients different opportunities and different options beyond just taking a drug or an injection.
Yeah, I think that IBD Ventures thing has always been something I found really fascinating about the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation here in the United States. And just, I think, something that is impactful for the patient community because it is more direct to consumer type of products. And so it's an exciting way of moving the needle, I think, for the community.
And if you look at, actually, it's obviously the foundation didn't invent it. There's 2 great examples of where it's been really successful. Cystic fibrosis, where the CF Foundation founded a company that then led to a number of drugs approved for cystic fibrosis. And the JDRF did some initial funding of both the scientist and the company that led to the first approved drug to prevent type 1 diabetes. So it just shows you how a small foundation can have a big impact on getting drugs to market that maybe otherwise may not have made it if it was just commercial interests alone.
Well, I think it also speaks to the power of patient choice as well. I mean, all of this is funded. Well, a lot of it is funded by, patient donations, people doing walks, people doing runs, people wanting to advance science. And that reminds me a little bit of the one thing that sort of was happening as you were coming on and Dr. Heller was leaving her role and retiring was the challenges in IBD, the process by which you sit down and kind of come up with the 5-year plan for what's going to be the vision for the research side of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. So that's called Challenges in IBD. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So that's something that happens every 5 years. And the reason the foundation does this is because the science is constantly changing, right? And we want to make sure every 5 years we do a reset and say, okay, where are the gaps and where are the opportunities and how could they be filled? And so usually what happens is the foundation gets hundreds, patients, physicians, scientists, people from industry into 5 working groups. And they go through in these 5 different areas, what are the gaps? How would we fill those gaps? And, help the foundation make a strategic plan into what to do. And we give them kind of guidelines. For example, if you had $1 million in this, what would you prioritize? If we had $5 million, what would you prioritize? Because we're very cognizant of, to your point, most of the revenue for the foundation comes from individual donors and families who care about IBD and want us to crack these problems. And so both patients are in the room helping pick the gaps and the opportunities, and also conscious that it's patient support that allows us to then put the money into those gaps and try and fill them. So this year we did the next 5-year plan, which launched in May. It's available, published in the IBD Journal. So it's online, it's freely accessible. And that kind of gives you a sense of here are the priorities, here's how we intend to fill them. And some of them look like they are, very feasible to do in a short period of time. Others may be more of a longer term thing. One of the things about this challenges, which is totally novel, is, typically the challenge has been focused on how do you get people into remission? How do you keep them into remission? But we've introduced 2 new areas this year. The first is preventing IBD in the first place, so patients don't get IBD. And then the second one is on the back end, when they're in remission for many years, how do we get them into what's called restoration? So not just feeling better, but actually physiologically restoring as close to normal as you can, with the limitations of you've had prior surgery around those things, but really aim higher than just remission, aiming for restoration. And I think that's achievable, but unless we raise the bar high, no one's ever going to aim for it.
I love that. I haven't heard that vernacular, calling it restoration. It's remission has always been the goal, but that's exciting that that's something that's on the horizon for the foundation to work towards.
Well, to that point, actually, when people have quizzed on patients what they understand by remission, it's totally variable, right? For remission, for me, might be 5 stool a day, less pain, whereas someone else, it might be 1 stool a day, no pain, fully functioning, going to work. And so I think we appreciated that there's a huge range of what people understand by remission, and restoration should just be a higher bar we're aiming for.
It reminds me a little bit of when they were, sort of the next phase of multiple sclerosis research was looking at not just preventing it, but actually restoring, rebuilding the myelin on the areas that have been damaged. And that is part of the next phase for them. So it reminds me of that, of how do we rebuild what's, the damage that's been done? Is there a way to sort of heal the mucosal in a way that's not something we're currently doing? That's super fascinating.
Yeah, certainly there's lessons to learn, to your point, from other diseases where people have aimed higher and aimed for both ends, right? Preventing the disease and restoring function. There's no reason why we can't be doing that with Crohn's and colitis.
Yeah, very much so. So the process by which you did this was that you gathered 80 different providers across the spectrum of, from APPs and dietitians and psychologists, all those folks that you mentioned. And then they went into 5 different work groups. How did you find these folks? How did you recruit for this process? And then can you kind of walk us through the work groups and what they focused on? Yeah,
so it's an open process. So there was a call for invitations probably a year ago, and all the groups contain several patients also. So it's not just providers. So there was an open call, and then people basically signed up and volunteered and were assigned to different groups based on their interests or their expertise. And so the 5 groups, and I always forget them, but I'll try my best. So one is preclinical, so the models, the lab type. The other is environmental triggers. The third is pragmatic clinical research trials. The fourth is precision medicine. And the fifth is novel technologies. And so if you think about all those 5 groups, it covers most of the areas, both in terms of patient needs, current management, future-facing technologies, and just better clinical practice overall. And so each of those groups then works for about 6 months. They come back with a list and we kind of refine it over several versions until we get a final version. And then it goes out for public commentary. So there's a 1-month window where anyone can comment on the final version. And then it goes to a final manuscript that gets published and then is out there for all to view and see. And hopefully these, surprisingly, I was surprised, the average paper gets about 15,000 views, or not 15,000 views or citations. So they're definitely, people look to them as inspiration for what they're doing in their own lab, what they're going to look for funding for, or just where the space is going.
I love that you allowed for public comments as well in there and included patients. I think, so much of this industry, pharmaceutical industry and the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation really recognizes that patients need to be in the conversation right from the beginning. And so I'm pleased to hear that was the case. Not surprised, but pleased. The one I want you to talk about is pragmatic clinical research. Pragmatic is the word that I'm just loving about that. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that group in particular?
So what that group is focused on, that area, is looking at things we do every day in practice that are sometimes not evidence-based. And we think, well, we do it, but we think we do it because it's right, but we're not sure. And so a good example of pragmatic clinical research will be looking at, for example, drug levels, right? There's a good example. We know drug levels can influence whether someone's responding or not to a drug. We know if you get drug levels to a certain level, it may help prolong the effects of a drug. That's one example. The other example of pragmatic clinical research will be looking at best practices. So, for example, if you go to the emergency room with your IBD, which no one wants to do, are there ways we could have as a toolkit to prevent people having to go to the emergency room, but just very simple interventions? And the IBD Chorus program, which is about practical research, did an initiative last year where they're able to drop ED visit rates by about 30%, just by providing sites with a practical toolkit to help patients avoid unnecessary ED visits. Because you know what happens when you go to the ED, right? You get a CAT scan and you get some narcotics and you go home. And that for IBD patients is probably the worst thing that can happen to them most of the time. So we wanted to find ways that you could practically provide tools that you could use in any practice to help avoid unnecessary visits when possible.
Got it. Thank you. But yes, there are like you said, lots of things that people do just because that's what they like to do, I think, as a provider, but it's interesting to kind of collect that information and see if there are things that people are doing that really kind of work that maybe you didn't think about.
If you look at the cancer field, they have developed national cancer standards of care that every place should use. And I would love to see for the foundation develop the same kind of tools where every GI provider has a list of here's the best practice for Crohn's, here's best practice for colitis, and follow them to best that they can, rather than, there's such huge variations in individual practices across the US. And at this stage, there's no reason why we haven't got a national standard of care that we hope everyone would aspire to for at least the most cases of Crohn's and colitis. There'll always be more complex cases, but we should have a national standard that everyone can at least try and attain and patients could refer to.
I think that would be particularly helpful for those community GIs like you were talking about that, they don't have the time to go and do specialized training. They don't have time to go to the Crohn's and Colitis Congress to get that really in-depth knowledge, but they know enough to be able to treat the regular average, quote unquote, for what that is, IBD patient. But somebody like Robin, that's not going to work.
Right.
Robin insists on being complicated. I shouldn't say that. Your IBD insists on being complicated.
It does. Yes. It's a special case.
Keep everybody on their toes, Robin, right?
Yes, including me.
So some of the things you've talked about, a lot of this was things that like initiatives that were under sort of Dr. Heller's command and her time at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. I know you've not been there very long, but how do you intend to shake things up there? While still respecting, of course, the legacy of Dr. Heller.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think the reason the foundation hired someone like me was because, I am more from being in the clinical at the coalface, so to speak, for many, many years and bring that perspective. And so what I'd like to do is there's a lot of things happening right now, a lot of things that are changing. We talked about AI. We talked about big data. We talked about all the things that are novel technologies. I would see my role as to shepherd those, that the that are successful with the patient view in mind, right? So they're patient-centric in how we develop them. We do it with the patient's best interest at heart, but also make them practical, that it's not just something that you can only get in the specialized centers, that you can get them anywhere in the US with a basic, level of best practices. I am very excited about the idea of being able to at least forward the design and concept of me having prevention of IBD studies. Like that would be, I think, a paradigm shift for us. It won't affect everybody, but if there was a small group who are at high risk of Crohn's or colitis and we could bring in a way to prevent their disease or delay its onset, I think that for me would be very impactful and something that we're working towards right now.
How close to figuring those people out are we, though?
There's some nice work. The Canadians, the GEM study has done some nice work looking at, it'll probably be a mix of people who have, a first degree relative, maybe some genetic risk based on genetic testing, and maybe some biomarkers in their stool or blood that says, okay, based on your family history, you're at high risk and you already have some early signs of subtle changes. In that group, you'd say, okay, that's a risk group who would probably be interested in some intervention. And there was a nice study from Europe, from EFCA, the European Crohn's Colitis Foundation last year, showing that 80% of patients in a survey were willing to at least consider preventative measures if they or a loved one were at risk of developing IBD. As you can imagine, the most popular measure they would consider would be lifestyle measures, change in diet, change in exercise, maybe manipulating the microbiome. And so that would be, I suspect, would be for a high-risk individual, a relatively easy sell. Logic would probably be a different discussion, but it may depend on really how high their risk is. But we all know plenty of families where, a brother, a sister, a sibling all have Crohn's, and you'd imagine for them it's a lot more of a consideration than someone who has no family history and has just one person with colitis. So I think there definitely is an at-risk group we can identify with some level of ease. And the next question is then, would they be willing to consider an intervention? And that's some of the gaps we need to fill with the science.
At what point in this process do you start adding in the payers? Because it's all fine and well for us to talk about this, but if your insurance isn't going to pay for it, there's a lot of people that will not do it. So I'm curious, at what stage do you allow or incorporate payers into this discussion?
That's a great point. Unfortunately, the payer system is a barrier to everything. My view is we have to look at what would be the best outcome, aim for it, prove it, do the research to convince them that it's effective and worth their while, and then we convince the payers. If we were waiting for the payers to agree up front, we'd never get anything done. But I think in experience, we know that like many areas, that patients benefit and the long-term benefits are there. So less surgery, less hospitalization, less ED visits. You can generally bring the payers around to, okay, this makes sense for us. Now, one of the challenges in the US system is that payers have a very short time horizon. They care about what are you going to cost me this year, maybe, not for the next 10 years. And that is a challenge, but there are many opportunities, or certainly many examples we've seen where the payers sign up for an agreement where, okay, if we do this and we reduce long-term complications, it'll save the payers obviously money in terms of hospital or medical costs, that they can be convinced to buy into it. But as I say, I think we would first of all go to show that it's effective, meaningful, safe, and then bring the payers to the table, because otherwise we'd never get anything done.
Yes. Everything you said is true and also such a bummer.
Agreed.
Really is.
I mean, even in Europe, though, it's not unique to the US. In Europe, the challenge there is access, right? They don't all have access to the right drugs. So the challenges are not unique to our system, but certainly it's always a barrier that everyone sees as well. We can't do this because of the payer. And as I say, my view is let's figure out what's right first and then figure out how to convince them to cover it.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I can't say Alan. I have to say Dr. Moss. Thank you so much, Dr. Moss, for coming on the show. But we have been talking for an hour and it's time for me to ask you the last question. So what is the one piece of advice that you have for the IBD community?
So I would say to IBD patients, I would say go out there, be proactive in your own care and find the physician or team that really are responsive to what your needs are, because that's very, very important. I think to everyone else, to the scientists and physicians, IBD is such a complex but also fascinating and interesting condition that there's so much to learn that there's opportunity for everyone just to keep on learning, and that's how we make advances.
This just popped in my brain as you were talking, and we've had Dr. Binion and Dr. Rubin on the show, and they both talked about like subcategories to IBD and it not just being Crohn's and colitis, or just like mild to moderate, and then moderate to severe. Has there been discussions about that in any of the work that the foundation is doing?
So the foundation has funded research that people have looked at what are often called endotypes. When we would rephrase Crohn's and colitis into IBD 1, 2, 3, 4. What's missing on that right now is showing that those individual subtypes have different trajectories, right? I think we'd have to show that the trajectories are unique to make the change, because it would be such a huge change, right? It would be a change for the FDA, a change for the payers, a change for patients. Patients often say to me, I got Crohn's or colitis? And if I say to them, well, a bit of both, that's the worst thing anyone wants to hear, right? People want to know what group they're in. So I think until the science tells us that those individual groups have differences in prognosis, which right now that doesn't tell us, it's not really a point where we could say, okay, we're going to relabel all this IBD 1 through 5, for example.
Right. Thank you.
Now, my last question is, you have been far from home for a while, but what do you miss about Ireland?
It's a good question. So I have to say people talk about the CRAC, CRAIC. It's not a drug. It's there's certain kind of attitude, carefreeness mixed with common sense that you certainly don't get everywhere. And I do certainly enjoy whenever we're traveling back to Ireland. I do miss the chocolate. You do not get milk chocolate anywhere else like you do in Ireland. So, and my family, of course, but I think they're a given.
I mean, yeah, that one, of course. Well, I like to feel like our podcast is full of crack, but I think it maybe depends.
Good crack.
Yeah.
Whenever an Irish person says, that's good crack, I'm like, yes.
That's right. Thus far, nobody has said that about our podcast yet, Robin, but we're just going to make the assumption that that's just a given with us.
Yeah.
So, well, Ellen, again, thank you so very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I think this has been super educational for folks, and it's really fun to hear a little bit. I'm guessing we'll learn even more about kind of your vision and plans for the future for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation now that you're in this new role. And we're excited to see that evolve. So thank you for joining us on the show. Thanks everybody else for listening as well. And cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure. Cheers. Hi, this is Dr. Alan Moss. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thank you.